Hey Carp Geeks, here we are. It's Memorial Day. It's November 11th, 2025, and we're a couple of weeks away from the Winter Carp Show. And at the Winter Carp Show, maybe you know, maybe you don't, I'll actually be presenting on both days my presentation, right, which is Quest for the Ultimate Carp Bait, Cracking the Amino Acid Code. Now I'm going to give you the show presentation here as kind of a preview, and if you are at the show, feel free to kind of ask questions, all that stuff, right? But hey, if you can't make it to the show, this is a great resource for you, right? So take a look, and it kind of details which has been the biggest problem, I think, almost forever with carp baits, which is, in terms of amino acids at least, getting the right amount of amino acids into the swim for a prolonged period. I'm glad to say, spoiler, we've solved the problem, okay? So we've been able to solve this fundamental problem, and we'll be launching this new product, it turns out, which contains this technology at the Winter Carp Show. So, okay, without further ado, let's take a peek. So I'm going to basically just read through my slides. I've got them right here, and, you know, this is essentially what I'll be doing at the show, but in person, right? So, yeah, same. All right. So bottom line is, yes, that's me, right? That's actually my research lab at that first slide there. That's my research lab at the college where I work. Got 4 fish tanks, 2 are dedicated to carp, 2 to catfish. All right. If you're at the show on Saturday, you'll have the pleasure of meeting Luke Venus and Ian Mitchell, who are Carpology testers, let's just say, and creators. And Luke and Ian actually did a test for us, which I'll talk about. They actually got a 13-to-1 catch rate differential when they did their Carpology test of our Impulse product. Maybe you've seen that video, maybe not, but hey, Ian and Luke be there to answer questions about their experiences in person. All right, so let's take a look at the first slide here. All right, so what's an amino acid? Classic question. We're creating these carp baits which have amino acids in them. They have this kind of mystical property of fish attractants and stimulants, but what actually are they? Well, turns out, and there's an unusual picture, okay, these particular individuals, bodybuilders, are very familiar with the chemistry of amino acids, because amino acids are essentially the building blocks of protein. So think of amino acids like Legos. You just click them together to make a larger structure. In the amino acid world, that larger structure is a protein or a muscle. Okay, so turns out that all living organisms, and bodybuilders in particular, do this to an extreme, right? We're always kind of breaking down old muscle tissue and replacing it with new, right? Unless you stress your muscles just stay the same size. But if you really stress your muscles by lifting weights, of course, you actually build them back bigger and stronger with more amino acids. This is why amino acids are popular with bodybuilding supplements. Now it turns out, press the button here, okay, that this turnover happens approximately, and I'll press the button and then read the comment. All right, so if you're like me, old, right, you remember a classic TV show from the 80s and 90s called Only Fools and Horses, and Trigger, who's on the right there, is talking to Rodney on the left there, and Trigger works for the council as a road sweeper, and he says his classic line, "I've maintained this broom for 20 years. He's had the same broom for 20 years. This broom has had 17 new heads and 40 new handles. So it's not really the same broom, and that was kind of the joke, right? And the same is true of us as humans. I am not, and you are not, the same person you were 7 years ago, because approximately all your cells turn over and are replaced every 7 years. Okay, and that's kind of interesting, because when cells and the proteins inside them break down, they release the building blocks again, the amino acids, into our surroundings through sweat and through other excretions. In fact, there's the next piece of the slide. Amino acids can be detected in sweat, in fingerprints, through what's called the ninhydrin test. And as you can see there, it stains the aminos purple in a fingerprint test. So the FBI used that to develop fingerprints. Okay, so the bottom line is this: living organisms, be them humans or fish, are leaving trails of amino acids wherever they go. And our premise with developing an amino acid fish feeding attractant / stimulant is that fish detect amino acids and follow the source of amino acids to the food. Okay, and that's essentially the philosophy of any amino acid containing bait. Okay, it's actually what happens in every single bait, but we've just hijacked essentially the signal to make it more potent. All right, so let's continue. No, amino acid work. If you're, again, older like me, okay, I'm a child of the 80s. I, hate to admit, I like Duran Duran now. Never used to. Okay, so back in the 80s, carp fever was in its kind of golden age with Kevin Maddox, carp fever, Rod Hutchinson, etc. And Kevin Maddox, I'm going to call him a citizen scientist because he does fantastic research on amino acids in his front room of his house. He had more on this in a moment, a giant fish tank, all right, a giant fish tank, and in which he had basically a small hose attached to a funnel which dripped amino acids into the gravel, and the fish, 2 or 3 large carp I think it was in the tank, would then respond to these amino acids. And he was able to show that, as it says on the slide, that amino acids when dissolved are legit fish feeding stimulants / attractants. The fish in his studies, for some of them, and you can see the table there, valine and lysine gave an excellent reaction. The fish were going bananas, they were literally eating the gravel. And then he developed like a league table of potency. And to be honest, literally any amino acid at the right strength will invoke a feeding response. It's just that Kevin's experiment, when he's adding just a little bit, the more potent ones are obviously better. Okay, but they all work to some degree. The best ones in terms of bang for the buck are valine and lysine. So Kevin proved this to be true in the 80s, and this was also, I think, following on from some academic work done in the 60s, which showed amino acids stimulate fish to feed. So he'd kind of I think maybe seen that. And he proved it. He proved it in an actual fish tank that it also is true. All right. And then, although Kevin Maddox is my, obviously, scientific angling hero, right, because I'm into aminos and he was the pioneer, he didn't develop it any further because he made a crucial mistake, and I just asked the question, what happened? So he showed that fish respond to amino acids really well, and then he made a critical error. He actually put amino acids in the base mix of a boilie, then classically boiled it to make a boilie, right? Boiled the base mix up to make a boilie with eggs. And what that does is it creates a hard, impermeable, that's the key word, impermeable skin around the boilie. So the amino acids weren't able to escape in large enough amounts to create the same effect he saw when he dribbled them into his tank. Super unfortunate, right? So he never got to what we now call threshold. So you need a certain level of amino acids around the bait to provoke a feeding response. He never got there because he locked them inside. Okay, in hindsight, that's an obvious thing, but at the time it was, obviously a bit of a mystery. All right. Anyway, since then, and I read Carp Fever back in, I think, '86 when I was probably in the 5th form at high school. It was instrumental to my life as a scientist and a carp angler, actually. All right. So since that time, I literally spent my whole adult life thinking about amino acids and how they can be used in carp baits. And I've discovered a few things, obviously, right? This is why we're here today. Okay, so bottom line is, those amino acids which are leaking into the environment from fish or whatever life form it is, bind to certain amino acid receptors in the organism, right? So in the fish, in the nares of their nose, there are chemoreceptors, little kind of lock and key type receptors for amino acids. Okay, and I'll keep going. I'll show you, right? And there's kind of a stylized version. These receptors are on the fingers of cilia, which look a lot like sea anemones. So imagine some really, really tiny sea anemones, essentially in your nose, right? And the fingers of those sea anemones hold the receptors, and they kind of waft around like the sea anemones actually do in the water, okay? But it's not a coral reef, it's the pond water they're waving around in, which has entered through the fish's nose. Now, turns out it's a kind of I call it the Goldilocks kind of problem, right? So when you have a very small amount of amino acids, we have like a too cold situation. The porridge isn't hot enough, there's not enough amino acids essentially to invoke a feeding response, and that's what we see there. Okay, if I add just a little bit more, and for single amino acids, and we'll see the problem in a moment, this is just a tiny little bit more, we see the just right Goldilocks amount, right? So between, and I'll tell you the details in a second, around 50% or a little bit higher, when more than 50% of the receptors are occupied, but less than 85% usually, all right? That's the perfect, what we call in medicine at least, therapeutic response, okay? That's where medicines work in terms of receptor occupancy. So that's what we think is going on. So when we get to between 50 and 85%, we see the perfect stimulated response from fish. However, that is a very, very narrow concentration range in practice, and typically we'll overdose, right? So we'll add too much and we'll occupy every single receptor. Then the fish literally, you know, it's like drinking 12 cups of coffee. You just basically, you know, you just want to get out of there, right? So the fish literally turn off when they overdose. It sounds bad, doesn't it, right? You associate the word overdose with something more sinister, but hey, it just turns the fish off, all right? So, you know, the too hot situation is too much. The too cold is not enough. The Goldilocks zone between 50 and 85% reception is just right. But as we've seen here, and this has been the Achilles heel of amino acids in fishing for more than 30 years, okay? Goldilocks zone, that 50 to 85% of occupancy, the just right, as we can see there, is an extremely narrow concentration range when you're dosing single amino acids. And in real terms, you have to put in 1.2 milligrams, I've done the math, right, per minute, right? So 1.2 milligrams of amino acid per minute has to be coming out of your bait to maintain this perfect Goldilocks zone. And in real terms, that's about 0.1 of a grain, right? So think of a grain of salt or a grain of sand or something, right? A grain of sugar, something like that. And a tenth of that. That amount has to be coming out of your bait every minute. If I had a grain too many or a grain too less, you're outside that range. So it's super hard to maintain that very narrow window. And that's why we see such inconsistent results, right? So people sometimes use amino acids, and I read books like, I think it's Tim Paisley's Guide to Carp Baits, where he talks about betaine, which is essentially an amino acid. And he says sometimes you get nothing, sometimes they're crawling up the rods. That is a direct observation, right? Based on too hot, too cold, just right. Okay, so when they're crawling up the rods, it's just right. When they're not, it's overdose or underdose. It's, you know, in hindsight, it's an obvious thing, but at the time it was a mystery. All right. Now, what's the trick? So my whole kind of academic focus has been trying to lock in that perfect 50 to 85% Goldilocks zone. Good news, there's a way you can do it, right? So if we just look at this slide, Mission Impossible, how can we establish and keep a 50% to 85% just right coverage? Here's the trick. You mix your amino acid with a fraction of what we call blockers, right? So molecules that occupy the sites but do not engage them. So it's like putting a key in a lock, but there's no shaft on the key. You can't turn it, right? It doesn't engage the lock. So you can block off the lock, but you can't engage the lock. Yeah. So if I mix a 50-50 mixture of amino acid and blocker, it doesn't matter how many total blockers and aminos I have. I could have the world's supply of them in the 50-50 ratio. When they fall over those receptors, they'll split out over the 9 receptors here, approximately half and half, right? And this is exactly what we do. So we mix our stimulatory amino acid, approximately 50-50, with proprietary blocking agent, PBA I call it, right? So no one will ever know what that is. That's kind of my secret. But it works, right? And that product is called Impulse. Now, if you get that concept, right? If you get the concept that, hey, it's now, as it says there, not about the concentration of amino acid. I can use as much or as little as I want within reason. It's within 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, right? It's all about ratio. So if I get the ratio of blocker and amino just right, put that in a bait, it will stimulate perfectly every time. And that is the fundamental basis of how Impulse and our new product, which we'll talk about at the show, Cyprophil, works. Okay, it's a blocker amino combination. It's a dual amino mixture. All right. Okay. I'm just flapping my gums, right? How many times have you kind of heard people kind of claim that their product is the best ever? Well, that's just talk. The proof is in the pudding, as they say, right? So what I've got here is, well, first I got some results from my research group. I'm actually a college professor. I have a research group. We study amino acids in the lab, and here is some results. So what I'll do, I'll just click here, right? And that'll just set the, we just look at that as we talk. That'll just set, you know, the video running there. And as you can see, I've got a fish tank, and it's got some small koi and a goldfish in there. And the fish are obviously feeding, and we'll talk about the details in a second, but on the top right there you can see kind of like my setup there. I got like, it's actually a tank off screen. I got 4 identical tanks set up in a similar way, so we're able to do repetitive studies. We're able to kind of repeat and show that it's like not a fluke, right? So talk you through it. So there, I mentioned Kevin earlier, right? So there's Kevin Maddox. Literally, I took a picture, I took a photograph of his setup in his book, right? And that was his setup. He had like a really, really large tank, 6x2x2, so massive fish tank. And he had 2 larger 5 or 6 pound carp in there. And as you can see, he basically dripped in amino acid solution. And I'm guessing, it's not stated in Carp Fever exactly how he did his study, but I'm guessing, and I know where he got his amino acids from because I used to live literally 6 miles from Gillingham, a place in Dorset, where Aldrich Chemicals set up their first English distribution centre. And they used to sell pure research grade amino acids out of that warehouse, essentially, which was across the road from the lake where I used to fish in. Anyway, so it's stated in his book where he got them, amino acids from Aldrich. And you buy them in up to 5 gram amounts, so I'm thinking he was probably using a gram at a time. That would be my guess, a gram in a pint or a gram in a litre, something of that sort, right? So, you know, he's probably in the 0.1 to 0.5% by weight area, if you're really interested in that. But anyway, that it works, right? So remember, he's dribbling them in, and he's starting from 0. So when he first dribbles them in, there's no aminos in the tank, and then he goes from 0 to something. So he goes through the 3 stages of stimulation, right? So, you know, and you know, you can see the fish there, that's optimal stimulation with impulse. It just doesn't matter what the concentration is, but he would see nothing, something, and then they'd turn off, right? And then the more potent it was, the quicker it would happen. And that's basically what his league table was. So excellent work, Kevin, from me, you know, 35 plus years later, or whatever it is, right? All those years ago. That was excellent work, and well done, right, from a PhD chemist in the present day. All right. So there we are. Now, we did modify Kevin's procedure just a little, okay? So instead of just dribbling the aminos in under the gravel with a hose, we've developed a proper, if you like, doser. It's a small cup, when you can see the picture there, with an aquarium air stone, right, attached to the hose, and then gravel over the top. The volume of that with the gravel is 150 milliliters, and then we dose about 250 milliliters through a large, it's called a dispensing burette, it's used in pharmacies, right? So we can monitor the strict amounts, and we can work out strict concentrations, right? So we add certain, you know, we actually start, if you're in the chemistry trade, we start at 10 to the minus 7 moles per liter, right? Which is approximately background amino acid concentration in nature, and then just ramp it up in tens from there. Okay, so we put in 150 of whatever concentration, and we just see the result. Now, the doser, I'll let it run again. The doser, and I've dyed the amino acids there, and you can see them, they're dyed black. They tumble over into a slight depression. So I've actually made a little depression in the gravel there. I call it Godric's Hollow, right? Very Harry Potter, right? And the fish, as you can see, once the amino acids tumble into that hollow, they just basically hit it like crazy. And there's no food in the tank, right? I know it's dyed, but we, you know, it's just dyed to show you where it is. We do 99% of our work without any dye, and it works just the same. So it's not dye. All right. So, you know, we see it's working. All right, so that was lab proof, which is kind of hard to do. It took a long time to get the tanks set up, because tanks are very small and you easily fill them with aminos. You have to develop this, it turns out you have to develop an amino acid gradient, which is a story for another day. But, you know, anyway, back to real life. So more kind of like up-to-date stuff. We actually sent this out, well, an early prototype of Impulse, actually. This is way back when. We sent it out to be tested at Sparsholt College, and Sparsholt College, you may know, is the UK's most prestigious, if you like, aquacultural research college. And 2 students, Tom and Ollie, both did theses on what was at the time called Biosource. It's called Biosource Baits because Biosource was our first product. Biosource is a very simple product. Anyway, Tom and Ollie showed that Biosource, which is now being improved to be Impulse, was shown to outfish similar non-dose baits by more than 2 to 1. Okay, so it's scientifically proven. You can look on the Aminotech, that's our research website, aminotech.com, and you can actually look at their actual theses, and there is proof there, which is irrefutable. All right. Now, our special guest today, oh wow, I say our special guest today, our special guest at the show on Saturday, if you're there, will be Luke and Ian from Carpology. Now, we hired Carpology to say, we said, hey, here's our impulse liquid, this is how you prepare it with pellets, go out and test it. Okay. Admittedly, our first test was horrible because we went to Horseshoe during spawning. And there were no fish around, and if the ones that there were busy doing other things. And a couple of weeks later we had Luke and Ian repeat and go to a slightly more kind of like runsy type water, and you know, they followed the instructions, they did exactly what we'd asked. They fished literally, and they can, you know, if you come to the show they'll describe what they did, but they basically fished pellets with impulse and pellets without impulse, otherwise identical setups, and they managed 13 fish on the impulse and 1 fish on the non-dosed, and it's very clear that it's working. Okay, and it just goes to show, if you like follow the instructions and just stay within the bounds of the instructions, it pretty much works, right? The only caveat I would say is that if you are going to test impulse, fish with 2 rods like Luke and Ian, because if there are no fish there you won't catch anything on either rod, but if there are fish there you'll catch more, pretty much guaranteed, on the impulse rod. Okay, so people sometimes say, oh, it didn't work for me. It's like, well, you know, you fish 1 rod, how do you know if there are fish there, right? So you got to fish 2, right? You got to fish 2 if you want to give it a proper test. There's details on the website about what we call the challenge, which you know, talks about how to set up a proper dual rod test, or just, you know, just copy Luke and Ian. All right, and you know, I just click there, and then we send it out to so Luke and Ian, big carp, right? And then we sent it out to Mark Sawyer, who got an 11-2 match fishing, right? So he actually caught a bunch of bream, because that's what was there on the day. And so it works. And it's interesting because pretty much all English fish, coarse fish at least, are members of the carp family. So you can catch bream, tench, chub, barbel, and of course carp on impulse. Okay, so impulse, we're actually, believe it or not, transitioning it to more of a match product because it catches literally anything. And later on in the talk I'll talk about cyprophil, which is literally Latin for carp lover, which is more of a carp dedicated big carp product, which we've just put the final touches to. So I'll talk about that in a minute. All right, and if you want to watch them, yeah, look at, you know, they're on, I actually have a website, Carp Geek TV, right? You've probably seen it. You might be watching it on Carp TV, Carp Geek TV right now. But anyway, those videos are there, and also on their relative, you know, their Angling Times and Carpology YouTube channels. All right, next slide. Now I'm just going to play this video, right? So this is the edited version of, it's just a few minutes, right, of Luke and Ian fishing, right, and testing the impulse. I will play it, and if necessary I'll pause it as we go. Okay, so there we go.
Today's video isn't just a jolly of me and Ian going fishing. There is substance to it, and we are doing a bit of an experiment. So we are using the stimulant from Biosource, the impulse stimulant, and yeah, like I say, it's a bit of an experiment. So when we got here earlier, we found a spot that was at quite a nice range, quite an easy fishable range, and it's about 45 yards, something like that, and it's between 2 swims. The idea of this is we are baiting that spot with the dosed pellet using the impulse stimulant, and we're both having a rod on that spot. Our other rods are outside rods, if you like, the ones that are either side of that spot. We are still baiting, but with normal pellet, no dose pellet, and the experiment is to see just how well this stimulant actually performs. If it does make a difference, if it doesn't, so far it's making quite a big difference.
All right, so real quick, Luke explained what is essentially the 2-rod setup. It's a slight modification because they were kind of like on adjacent swims. So actually the outside swim on each swim was non-dosed, and the central swim they shared was dosed. So it was actually 1 impulse swim versus 2 non-dosed swims, which is interesting, right? Okay, and you know, already mentioned the result, 13-1. Let's see how they got that, right?
I haven't had a day session like this for a little while, so yeah, to be getting bite after bite, it's insane. Really enjoying this. Yeah, they're not big fish, but at the end of the day, it is nice to get a bend in the rod, and you never quite know what's going to come out of it. There's a lot of small commons, but it has been known that there's a few 30s in here and things like that. So there's every chance that if we're wading through this many fish, then one of the better ones could come along. that is our day coming to an end, and it is time to go through our findings, I guess.
Interesting findings.
Interesting findings.
They're not just any findings.
So, as you know, we were fishing 2 on a spot between us, and then we had 2 rods outside that spot. Same range, just 15, 20 yards either side of the spot.
Yep. Same bait.
Same bait.
Same rigs.
Same rigs.
Same tactics.
Everything was baited the same way, other than the fact we had the dosed pellet in the middle, and we had normal pellet either side. We had 1 fish either side. All the rest came from the dosed pellet spot.
Yes.
Which I say all the rest, that's 13 others?
Yes.
I
13.
think we kind of lost count a little bit, but I think we had about 14 fish between us.
It's been hectic.
It has been very hectic. So, take that as you will. It's hard to say it hasn't worked.
It's hard to say it hasn't worked. Yes. So, again, if you are at the show,
isn't just a jolly.
If you are at the show on the Saturday, feel free to ask Luke and Ian questions directly. Okay, because they will be there. Okay, but yeah, 13-1, can't argue with that, right? Okay, so if we do the correct 2-rod setup, we can prove that it works. Here are a few common questions and answers I often get, right? Okay. Statement: impulse needs to get to the bottom. You can't be dispersing impulse in a sloppy kind of like spod mix, because you need to kind of get it to the bottom and concentrate it to get that threshold concentration around your bait. Okay, so impulse liquid, which is our primary product, is used with porous baits very well. So think about pellets, classic, ground bait, things like that. All right, harder baits, boilies, particles, we have a gel, so you can use the gel instead. Okay, the bottom line is you've got to get the bait to the bottom and then it seeps out. That's the trick. Yep, impulse needs to establish a minimum concentration. This is the Kevin Maddox argument, right? So you can't really use impulse unless you have a super porous boilie or a soluble boilie, more on that in a minute. You can't really use impulse liquid in your boilies because it just won't come out quick enough to establish a threshold concentration. And that was Kevin Maddox's problem back in the 80s. Okay, so he made this fantastic discovery but wasn't able to capitalize on it with a delivery system that worked. Okay, and we see this quite a lot actually. You see these bait companies, goo is a classic, right? So like people will soak goo forever in these boilies and shake them around, keep dosing, and then after about 3 months they'll cut them open and the goo's soaked all the way through, which is great, right? It makes a nice bait. But if you think about it, and this is why I've got a picture of a fjord, right? So, I've been to the fjords, and the classic question on the boat at the fjords is how deep's the fjord? And rather than give you a number, the guide will typically say the fjord is about as deep as the mountain is high. So if you look at that picture, that's how deep that fjord is, right? Now, why am I telling you this? Because how long it takes for the goo to soak into a bait mountain high is how long it takes to come out fjord deep, okay? So those impervious baits or less porous baits, yeah, you can soak them for a long time, but they wouldn't work with impulse because it won't come out quick enough. You can do a surface coating. That's why we created the gel. But if you want to use, again, impulse in a base mix, it has to be a soluble boilie or very porous boilie. It can be done. We've done it before, more in a moment. But yeah, it does work, but you've got to get the right boilie. Okay. Impulse is a food product. Amino acids are essentially soy sauce, right? So think of it like that shelf life milk, right? Once you open it, you've got a couple of days, right? But it can stay on the shelf forever as long as it isn't open because it's pasteurized or homogeneous, whatever they do, right? So it turns out that impulse liquid in the concentrated form is quite acidic. So it's like vinegar in a bottle. It just lasts forever. When you start diluting it and mixing it with other things, it will have a shelf life then. So the clock starts once you've kind of poured it into other things and diluted it, right? So, if you're putting it in your glug or whatever, you got, well, we'll say 48 hours typically to use your bait, okay? So, rule of thumb, try and use fresh bait, freshly dosed bait, I should say, when fishing, Okay, so if you're making maybe a spod mix for 2 days, make half of it, put it in, and then when it's time to re-spod a day later, make it fresh, and your impulse will be good. All right, the Holy Grail. Now, this is really why I'm at the show this year. Okay, I want to discuss how we overcame that boilie problem. Now, I've already told you about Kevin Maddox's fatal error, essentially locking the amino acids inside a boilie, right? So you need, either a porous or a soluble boilie, and that's the trick, right? So we've overcome the boilie problem in a very, very, I think, clever way, okay? So what we've done, and you can actually pick these up at the show, right? We've actually created feed boilies that contain Cyprophil, which is our kind of a slightly carp-centric product, right? So our newer product, Cyprophil, right, is encapsulated within these soluble boilies. And we've got these soluble boilies, and they break down over 3 different time periods, right? So you throw in a bunch of boilies at the start. The 1 to 2 hour ones will kick off your swim. The 8-hour breakdown times will top it up. And then if you're there for the whole weekend, the 24-hour ones will top that up, right? And they are color-coded, right? The deepest color breaks down the quickest, right? And the lightest color is the slowest, right? So you can actually pick them out of the bag if you want and mix and match, do whatever you want, right? So we call it the traffic light approach, right? So we'll have this traffic light kind of system for different breakdown times for soluble boilies. And if you just, if you just want to go for a day, just throw in half and half, 1 to 2 hours and 8 hours, and just fish over the top. It will maintain that level of stimulant in the swim through that whole time period if you get it right. And this is new this year, so we are looking for feedback from anglers who actually come up to the the booth and pick up some of this. We're doing it pretty much at cost, right? So the idea is that, hey, we provide these soluble boilies at cost with this fantastic new science, and anglers get back to us with their results, and we kind of fine-tune maybe the ratio, right? I mean, do you need more 8? Do you need more 24 for this particular situation? How many? That kind of thing. And they're available in 2 flavors. There's the classic fish and there's the classic sweet cream. Okay, the fish is kind of a green color, and the sweet cream is kind of a blackish, kind of dark color. Okay, so they are designed as kind of blend-in feed boilies, right? And we are supplying, actually, I think this is true, at the time of recording this, we are planning to include a few hook baits with the feed boilies. So you'll have a match the hatch type hook bait, or you can use your own, right? You can use your own. If you want to do a bright pop-up over the top, go for it, right? And feel free to use the gel on the individual hook bait. It'll make it even better. All right, so there it is, just confirmation. So the show special, limited amounts available breakdown Cyprophil. That's our new carp-focused version of Impulse, available at the booth. So stop by. We're doing, I think, don't quote me, but I think it's like £10 for a big old bag of boilies and some hook baits. So well worth, and that's literally at cost because you want that feedback. All right, well worth a go. All right. Thanks for coming. This will be the end of the show if you were there, okay? And, I can't help myself, right? I was testing Cyprophil this summer, and in July 2025, after pre-betting a spot for a while and fishing with a Cyprophil prototype boilie, got that bad boy, right? So my best ever carp, it was a grass carp actually, was on a prototype Cyprophil boilie. All right, if you look there, that's my I have a YouTube channel where I just film myself fishing. I've got the whole thing on video. It's kind of somewhat Keystone Cops at times, but you see me land this giant monster fish. Kind of fun. Have a look at that, Carp Geek TV on YouTube. All right, and yeah, as I mentioned, if you are at the show, be sure to pick up some boilies and any questions. Right, so that is the show. Hope to see you there. If you are there, be sure to mention you saw me on the YouTube, right? And come with questions, pick up some boilies, have a nice chat. I'm really looking forward to the Winter Carp Show. It's actually at the end of November, so it's literally the last couple of days of November this year. I think it's the 29th and 30th maybe of November, something like that. And it's at Sandown Racecourse in Surrey. Okay, so hopefully I'll see you there. Any questions? info@biosourcebase.com. All right, see you next time.